Just like a roller coaster ride, as you kind of tick up the roller coaster, you know that the steeper the incline, the more fall and drop you're going to have. You start to sweat, your adrenaline starts to pump. The more you back up that incline, you start to really get, oh my God, this is going to, your throat, your stomach starts to jump into your throat. You start to sweat, your eyes, start to water. This is where you're really getting excited because you're anticipating how low we're about to fall, how low we're about to go. Do we really want to get this high? Because if we get this high, that fall is going to be devastating. So that's what you're doing. You want your audience to be in that feeling. You want your character, this is his last chance. This moment of enlightenment, this moment of lifting, as much as it's elevating and it's exciting and it's thrusting you forward, it's also anxiety building. The anticipation is growing. You really want us to get here. And that we can clearly see happens in an action film. We can clearly see how the fight choreography gets more intense. The chase scene as he's following through, as he launches out, I've got the clue, I know where the terrace is, and he goes after it. We can see there's this explosion of excitement. That is going to bring us to our climax. And your climax is the highest point of dramatic tension. So again, vocabulary. Climax is the highest point of dramatic tension. These words I want you to commit to memory because these are words that once you're a craftsman and when you're talking with other filmmakers, you're talking with other videographers, you're talking with other commercial directors, producers, writers, they're all, even to do your job, this is language that's learned. If you are hired to create video promo for Cleveland Clinic, this is even the language you want to be using, that this moment in the promo is our climax. You don't need to define that it's the highest point of dramatic tension because working with other filmmakers and working with other video creators and motion media content providers, you're going to all understand what we mean by the word climax. It is the highest point of dramatic tension. So very easy in action film, this is the moment where he's, our anticipation rising to it has been him running off through the helicopter, chasing the boat on the water, then climbing down to a building, scaffolding down the building, running, jumping onto a train and following the train, jumping into the water to catch up with the speedboat, knocking the terrorist off the boat, putting him fighting in the water until you come up on shore. And now that protagonist is finally face to face with the antagonist, has him in his grasp, has him in his hands in this fist-to-fist combat or the shoot-to-shoot, whatever your action film is. Your anticipation was all of that vehicle jumping to get here, to this scene, to this moment. Just like your other story moments, a climax is one scene, one specific moment. Your last fall was one scene, one specific moment. Your first fall was one scene, one specific moment. Your call to action, one scene, one specific moment. Your status quo, one scene, one specific moment. Now you may have 55, 10 scenes in between here. You may have 55 or 5 or 2 scenes in between here. You may have 23 scenes in between here. You may have 30 scenes between here. You may have 2 scenes between here. But each one of these story points is its own scene. So here we are in our climax. For our dramatic film, for our internal angst film that we have with our priest, this climax is going to be just as intense and just as riveting as a combat, as a fist fight, as a shootout. It's going to have the same adrenaline. Your audience is still going to have, as we're leading up into that, as we're going from the dark night of the soul and the enlightenment, and that leading us up to this steep moment, you're still going to have your audience with their palms sweating, with their voice, they're holding their breath, with their stomach in their throat. You're still going to have water coming to their eyes, but for a very different reason. It's not because 2 people are fighting, fist fighting, but it is because now you have a climax in which people are emotionally grappling with something, where people are emotionally targeting something. A really great example of this is Good Will Hunting. In the film Good Will Hunting, its climax is a dialogue, which in many dramatic films, the climax is a dialogue. That is going to be your highest point of dramatic tension. The tension between one person in the conversation and the other person in the conversation. This also is where subtext moves from being subtext to being text. This is where all that subconscious, unconscious stuff breaks through and becomes the text. So in Good Will Hunting, which is a great example of this moment, you have the main character, Matt Damon, and you have as the protagonist, and you have his best confidant, Robin Williams. His best friend and Robin Williams throughout the entire film, his best friend being played by Ben Affleck, and Robin Williams, his confidant, both of them throughout the film have been telling Matt Damon's character that because of his talents, because of his skill as a mathematician, he should be able to get out of this really bad neighborhood in Boston that he grew up in. It's rife with poverty and violence, and his ability to be a mathematician could get him out. Currently, he works as a janitor for Harvard, but he could actually be a student at Harvard instead because of his abilities. Matt Damon's character has never seen that in his life. He's never believed it to be real for him. He believes that he will stay just as poor and just as out of touch with his talent as the environment that he was born within. He hits a moment with Robin Williams where they're talking about why Matt Damon simply won't take his talent and go for it. And Matt and Robin Williams hits a point in this dialogue that the two of them are intense and they're back and forth. Matt Damon telling him, you don't know me, you don't know my life, you think you know my life, but you don't know how hard it is for me and where I live and where I grew up. And Robin Williams' character saying, I know you, I know where you're coming from, I know what your life is about, and I'm telling you what more you can do. And we hit a point in this tension dialogue, and this dialogue between these two people butting heads, where Robin Williams tells Matt Damon, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And the scene and the moment, it repeats itself in those lines, in that dialogue, because all of a sudden, what was the subtext, what was underneath, now comes up and is text for Matt Damon's character. He thought, or he felt, the subtext that was driving underneath this was that everything that's bad that's happened in his life is his fault. That it's his fault that his dad wasn't around, that it's his fault that he grew up poor, that it's his fault that he's a janitor and not something more with his life. And to hear someone tell him, it is not your fault, becomes the most difficult and riveting thing for him to hear. And this is where your audience begins to have that climactic emotional release. They begin to feel this moment where the art that has been imitating life succeeds and truth comes through. This is what you want to have happen in your climax. This is why it is the highest point of dramatic tension. This also happens in a comedy. We also have The Last Fall and The Dark Night of the Soul in a comedy. The example that Blake Snyder gives is the movie Elf, in which Will Ferrell's character thinks he is an elf, wants to be an elf, had grown up as an elf, and now had to leave. His Dark Night of the Soul is, in a comedy, it's still a low, horrible, miserable moment for the character, except when it's depicted comedically. We are laughing at that moment. And that falls in line with the catharsis of laughter. That, even there's a phrase, I laughed but if not to cry. So it is saying that there comes a moment where you look back at your life, you look back at your misery, and you just laugh at it. You're in the moment of your misery, and you just start laughing. It's a cathartic release. It's of the other end of the spectrum of crying. And so in Elf, those of you who remember the movie, this Dark Night of the Soul for Will Ferrell's character is where he's actually contemplating suicide. And we're laughing at it because there is something that filmmaker is expressing, this very real moment in life, and a very real reaction that some of us have sometimes. We're in that kind of moment where we sit back and we laugh at ourselves. And that laughter actually becomes the savior. That becomes that moment where we start to take ourselves less seriously. Because as bad as I think my life is, I can laugh because you know what? It's not that bad. And that's healing for us to say it's not that bad. And so when we go into our climax for a comedy, we're still in our highest point of dramatic tension. We still are having two characters that are eggheads, that are butting, and where there's tension is intense, where we're having our main character drive very determinedly and with the enlightenment that's come out of The Dark Night of the Soul, driving into his last and best attempt. After he's lost everything, he's got nothing else to lose. And the reason that for a comedy that moment is so filled with laughter is because as we're watching that climax, as we're watching that tension, we're getting that release of laughter. So in a comedy, your climax should be your most hilarious scene. This should be the scene where your audience is holding their sides because if they're laughing so hard it hurts. The sort of I'm in stitches. I'm laughing so much. So that's what you want out of your climax in a comedy. This is where you actually break out of Act 2 and into Act 3. As you enter the scene of the climax, you are in Act 2. As you exit the scene of the climax, you are firmly in Act 3. And just as we feel in real life, when we come out of a high tense situation, there is this moment of exhaustion. There is this moment of relief. So we actually are going to come down emotionally at this point. We're going to come down because now we're moving into our conclusion. And now we're going to plateau out. We're at the end of our story. We now have established a new status quo. Notice we are not as low as we were when we started, because this is the world that is going to change. We're not going to return to it. But we're certainly going to come off the roller coaster ride, and we're going to flatten out into our conclusion. So the elements that we have going on in our Act 3 is the conclusion of the film. In the conclusion of the film, you are going to actually tell us what happened. Did the character achieve their objective? Did the character fulfill their desire? This climax was their last best attempt, which is why the moment you're at the end of the climax, you're breaking into Act 3, because the end of your climax scene, he either does catch the terrorist or he doesn't catch the terrorist. He either leaves the priesthood or he doesn't leave the priesthood. This is actually what your climax scene ends in, which is why it lands us, the end of it lands us in Act 3. Did the character achieve their objective or did they fulfill their desire? Every film does not conclude with the character achieving it. Your conclusion says did, yes or no. Sometimes that answer is no. And even in those films, there is a sense of purpose to having told this entire story. The character, what you want to express when the answer is no, the character did not achieve their goal, the character did not fulfill their desire, the answer that you want to give to truly complete and make a strong film is, what does the character think about it? Because that's going to give purpose to everything that's happened in these 2 hours, or hour and a half, or 30 minutes if it's a television show, or 30 seconds if it's a commercial. What's going to give it meaning is what the protagonist feels about achieving or not achieving their objective. You must express their own thought of it. As they look back at all of this that's happened, what do they think? And most times they think that they are in a better place than they were when they began. Whether they achieved the goal or didn't achieve the goal, they are in a better place. They're in a new sense. They have a new clarity on life. They have a new reality that matches more clearly with what this thing called life actually is. So remember, in your conclusion, you are going to answer, did the protagonist achieve their objective or their goal? And most importantly, did the protagonist achieve their objective or fulfill their desire? And most importantly, what do they think about it? This is what's important in your conclusion.